Club Soda, and I'm not even a member. Hello, dudes, dudettes, duders, and everyone in between, and welcome to How to Do Everything So You Don't Have to, the series where we teach you how to think like a producer. In addition to this channel, I also appear as a panelist on a daily program called Office Hours. It's a live panel show where questions are asked by the audience and the panelists do their best to answer them in real time. A question recently came up about neurodivergence in the workplace, and I took my best stab at answering it. While my response wasn't a catastrophe, it stuck in my craw that I didn't nail it with the precision I'd like. So I figured, why not take a moment to tackle the question again, this time with the benefit of time to organize my thoughts, a script, and my good old pal, teleprompter. So here's the question that was originally asked. When working with neurodiverse crew and employees, how far do you go when coaching them in communication patterns that others pick up on their own? Now look, that's a pretty dense question, even before you realize that there's more ambiguity to it than specificity, and this means that we have to make some assumptions going in. The biggest one that I'm going to make is that the neurodivergence in question is related to the autism spectrum, and there are a couple of reasons that I'm making that leap. The first is that autism is commonly discussed and increasingly understood and accommodated in professional environments. The second is that the question also mentions communication patterns and concerns about missed messages in day-to-day interactions, which is a pretty significant piece of the autism puzzle. Of course, missing social cues isn't isolated to the autism spectrum, and being on the spectrum doesn't mean that missing social cues is guaranteed, but it still seems reasonable that the person asking the question is considering something more like autism than something like schizophrenia or depression. The third reason I'm assuming autism is due to the blinders that I live with. Autism runs in my family, informing my genetics and how I relate to the people I love. While I've never been diagnosed, I suspect that I am on the spectrum. Because autism is very present in my life, when I see a question about neurodiversity and missed communication cues, I'm likely going to frame it in relation to autism. As the saying goes, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You know what? Let's flip the script for once. To a nail, every threat looks like a hammer. God, everyone's riding hammers all the time, but when the rubber hits the road, it's the nails that really need our empathy. You know what? That too. Let's flip the script again. When the road gets hit by rubber, it's the nails that need our empathy. If there's one thing you take away from this channel, I hope it's that sentence. Less important than rubber nails and more relevant to this video is the burning question, why is accommodating neurodivergence good for your business? If you're running a small business, you get you for free. You're going to be on the clock pretty much 24/7 to make sure the operation doesn't implode, so if you ever have questions about how you'd approach a problem, you are always on standby to give yourself advice. Every person that you hire beyond you can either be another you or someone new. Seeing as you already get you for free, if you're going to be spending money, why not spend it on not you? While skills, training, and experience are all factors we consider when hiring, those are not the primary metrics. Skills can be taught, technique can be cultivated and refined. What I can't do in a day of production is give you a lifetime of perspective that's different from mine. So factors we look at in addition to technical knowledge are creativity, problem-solving skills, and worldviews that we don't natively have access to. Those things bring terrific value to production, and that's where we want to allocate our budgets, knowing that we can fill in knowledge gaps over time. The human creature seems programmed to find comfort in the familiar. I believe it's reasonable to assume that there's a genetic impulse to band together to work on group projects, and that bit of code is largely responsible for the progress we've been able to make as a species. The impulse to protect the familiar and share increasingly complicated information within the community is what allowed our small tribes to grow and move from nomadic cultures to agrarian, to industrial, and beyond. There is a cost to this bit of hardwiring, though. The more prone we are to protecting the familiar, the less prone we are to welcoming the foreign. When applied in modern life, where networks and communities we've built require millions of people to function instead of dozens, these impulses can have negative consequences. In a vacuum, though, there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about protecting the familiar or good or bad about welcoming the foreign. Both are essential, and each one comes with its own costs and benefits to the community. Thousands of years ago, this impulse allowed our species to survive against terrible odds and bought us the time we needed to form language and develop tools and societies and all that junk. I do worry that these impulses have outlived the life and death programming, though, and now have the potential to hold our societies hostage, and we see this manifest as xenophobia or racism. Perhaps you've been in a situation where you couldn't understand why it was so hard for someone to decouple themselves from racist or xenophobic impulses, like their lives depended on them rejecting groups of people because they look or speak differently. I believe that it's because our DNA has instructions that tell us that our lives depend on rejecting groups of people who look or speak differently. I'm not saying this to excuse racism or xenophobia. I'm saying it in the hopes that if more people are aware of how these impulses are connected to their genetic code and the function they once served, they'll also be aware of the trick their DNA is playing on them now, and possibly become more aware of how a disproportionate rejection of the foreign damages their success in business. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to give you an example of how deep this code runs in our DNA. I was sitting in a diner one morning in Glendale, and a trans woman and her friend sat down for breakfast at a booth near mine. The woman was discussing a production she was directing and the incredible cast and crew they were able to assemble. As a point of pride, she said, and I am quoting this word for word, "It was the most diverse crew I'd ever seen. Everyone on it was trans." I consider this a perfect example of how deeply this genetic code runs because, while I'm not a member of the trans community myself, as far as I can tell, they have had to fight tooth and nail, not just for so-called luxuries like inclusion, but for more fundamental things too, like community leaders to consistently speak about them as if they're, human beings. It seems to me that any member of the trans community would be acutely aware of our species' inclination to reject the unfamiliar and the importance of pushing back against that impulse. Also, knowing the diner we were both eating in, I can say with confidence that the contradiction embedded in what she'd said wasn't due to privilege. This was not the kind of place the wealthy go to ignore the struggles of the less fortunate. It makes more sense to me that the genetic code that encourages us to congregate with people who reflect what we consider essential in ourselves is so strong that it leaves us with terrific blind spots to the lack of diversity in the teams that we build. I perceive this to be a liability when running a business and a catastrophe when creating art. If the art you create isn't built on a proactive pursuit of new ideas and emotions, you run the risk of endlessly remixing the ideas and emotions you've already been expressing. You're certainly allowed to limit your output to remixes of previous ideas and expressions, but if that's your plan as an artist, you sorta lose the right to complain if you're replaced with AI. I'm not saying that it's fair or good or right for you to be replaced by AI. I'm just saying that you lose the right to complain about it. Of course, I'm not oblivious to the benefits of hiring people with a background similar to your own. When I hire someone who attended my alma mater, not only do I have a general idea of what they will already know about production protocols, which saves incredible amounts of time, but I also get updates about a place and people important to my heart. A shared cultural context and shorthand can expedite communication, which is only good for production. Also, the more time you invest into a consistent network, the more likely you are to be recommended within that network for other productions. I just want you to be aware of the genetic code that's chugging along under the hood and the damage it can do to your projects if you're not actively aware of how it's narrowing your worldview. I believe that I've made a compelling case for diversity in the teams you build, and an important component of crew diversity is neurodiversity, which brings its own complications and challenges when building a team. There are two key questions that we'll address in this video about integrating neurodiverse employees into a project. From a humanitarian perspective, the most important concern is how we accommodate neurodiversity on our productions. From a business perspective, the most important concern is how we troubleshoot when the diversity of our crew results in friction. Because it's the neurodivergence that I'm most familiar with, this video will focus on autism. Because autism is a spectrum, there are as many unique forms of autism as there are people on the spectrum. I'll be speaking in generalities, and what I say will be informed by my life experience. If you feel that I'm missing the mark, I'd encourage you to jump into the comments and share your perspective. With that said, let's get into onboarding an employee who is neurodivergent and the biggest mistake a producer can make at this stage. This mistake is for the producer to frame their understanding of the employee around outward behavior. I mean, it makes sense. You see a person do a thing, and then you assume that they're the type of person who would do the thing that they just did. It's pretty basic stuff. The problem here is that outward behavior is data that's available to everyone all the time. The more complicated a data set you're working with, the greater advantage you will have in your business. So instead of being content with an understanding of your coworkers through their outward behavior, it seems to make more sense to understand them through their inward experiences, whether they're neurodivergent or not. How do they perceive and experience the world? How does it feel for them to move through life? Efforts to guide the behavior of an employee shouldn't begin with an understanding of behavior, but of the context in which they exist that led to such behavior. One benefit of staffing your projects with people who share your culture and background is that the context for their outward behavior is largely already established. The greater diversity you're able to accommodate on your projects, the more time you'll have to put into everyone understanding each other's context. But the benefit is that you'll have more perspectives and angles from which to approach a problem when it comes up. A perfect example of outward behavior being a poor representation of inward experience is when my wife and I started dating. We didn't live together and she would want to chat on the phone in the evenings. It frustrated her that I'd keep all calls as short as possible, like 3 minutes was at the edge of what I could handle. What she didn't understand at the time was that I experience sound differently than she does. The audio coming from a phone call is so irritating as to be considered painful to me. As she came to understand how I experience sound differently than her, she was able to tolerate the fact that I would have been willing to pay money to end a phone call with her as quickly as possible. But what she didn't tolerate was me saying things like, I would pay money to end phone calls with you as quickly as possible, which is something I said to her. Now, imagine someone like me in a work environment. This type of behavior can seem really disrespectful from the perspective of an employer. If you have an employee who simply can't do long Zoom meetings, take a moment to find out why. People are fluent in self, meaning that they can usually speak intelligently and at length about how they experience and perceive the world. Maybe you've got a me on your team, someone who knows production and can implement it really well, but hates the experience of bad audio. Find out what the world is like from their perspective. Understanding how someone else experiences the world around them tends to reveal more about their outward behavior than their outward behavior does. This is true whether the employee is neurodivergent or neurotypical, keeping in mind that if there are two people in the room, you are both equally divergent from each other. Neither of you is neurotypical or neurodivergent. You're both just two people with different ways of processing the same world. What's true at 2 people is also true at 2 billion people. Those 2 billion people are all exactly as different from each other as they are from each other. The scale at which you can understand and accommodate those differences will define the ceiling on your business and your ability to move through the world comfortably. But how do you coach behavior like that? When the majority of your team is sitting comfortably in 2 hours of Zoom meetings every day and someone comes in with an attitude like mine, it can be really disruptive. But it doesn't have to be destructive, and that comes down to how you handle these situations as a team leader. The first thing to keep in mind is that you can't turn a cruise ship 90 degrees. But if you turn it 1 degree and continue moving forward, within a day you'll be miles from where you would have been without the adjustment. In a couple of weeks, where you would have been will be so far away that it'll be a distant memory. Minor adjustments make a huge difference over time. My wife never asked a 90-degree turn of me on the topic. She never said that I had to enjoy phone calls or even suffer through them. That would have been a 90-degree turn. The 1-degree turn that she requested was that I consider how it might hurt her feelings if I say something like, I'd pay money to not talk to you on the phone. The 90-degree turn isn't realistic. The 1-degree turn often boils down to basic human decency. But what can you do when micro-adjustments simply aren't possible? Perhaps there's a behavior or friction that makes sustaining production impossible. It's not the mighty death pop for the employee or the project. If you can, pull them from the main action and try to find a task that requires a bit less interfacing with large teams in high-pressure situations. I've worked on heaps of productions in all different sizes in pre-production filming and editing. I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who tend to exhibit more traits associated with the autism spectrum also tend to find their flow state in post environments. It's an environment where lighting and audio are acutely controlled and very predictable. Picking up on social cues isn't a constant concern in post environments because the majority of the time is spent parsing data, not people. If conflict resolution isn't where you shine, perhaps consider focusing on timeline resolution. So, if you find yourself with an employee that's showing potential but also having trouble integrating, consider the possibility that there might be other environments within your pipeline where they'll have an easier time finding their flow state. The problem with solutions is that, like the challenges your business faces, they're all unique. So there's no prescription I can give you that will cover every situation. The goal here is to get you to consider how the context differs for each member of the team, knowing that you'll have to have some familiarity with how they process the world to access that information. You simply can't know why a person does a thing because they did the thing, and everyone has a reason for everything they do. The greater your ability is to understand those reasons, the higher the ceiling will be on your business's capacity. I don't know if I've made a compelling case for integrating more neurodivergent people into your teams and workflow. I feel like I've outlined pretty clearly the extra cost that a diverse team will put on your production. The more diverse your team is, the slower things will move because more time is needed to understand and share the core contexts that make communication possible. The added costs are time and money, and that's pretty concrete. The added benefit of worldviews and unique perspectives are conceptual at best, and who knows, maybe after hearing me blither on for 15 minutes, you'd be the one willing to pay money to end this conversation. You know what? That's kind of the best case scenario though, now that I think about it. You watch this video and maybe I've accidentally talked you out of hiring people who are neurodivergent like me, which brings down their market value, and then I can hire everyone who's different just like me, and then I'll have the most diverse crew in the world. Thank you so much for watching this video and considering these thoughts. If you found any value in these ideas, you might want to subscribe. If you disagreed with these ideas, please tell me where I've missed the mark. And once you've done that, please turn off YouTube and go do a creative project with someone who has a background and worldview as different from yours as possible.